Hold tight there, gentlemen. All right, we should have another.
We're still getting super chats.
We're still getting super chats.
Yeah,
you gotta love the community for white well-being. You have to love them. Okay.
Wait. Yeah, no, they're hearing us. Okay.
What?
I'm seeing that they're hearing us.
Are we audible?
I'm going to turn my camera back on and make sure that doesn't screw anything out. Too much energy through the broadband. Guys, you hear us? All right. We were about to start a new stream. Sound is good.
Great. All right.
So if that didn't rattle everyone, why don't I take us in? So yes, Jason, for all of you joining late, Jason gave a wonderful entry to John here, the editor-in-chief of Arktos Publishing. Of course, there's also an Arktos web journal that publishes articles, and John has the Interregnum podcast. So we are going to be speaking a lot today about globalism and the general state of affairs in the wider European world. It's going to be a fascinating talk, and we're very, very happy to be speaking with you, John. But first, why don't you just introduce yourself, and you can also speak a little about how you came to be the editor-in-chief at Arktos and what the general aims of that publishing house, the online journal, and your podcast Interregnum are. Welcome.
Excellent. Thanks so much, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, despite the turbulence that we've encountered so far. But so my name is John Bruce Leonard, and I am editor-in-chief of Arktos Publishing. I hail from the United States of America, as I'm sure my accent betrays, but I live in Europe now. Anyway, I have been the editor-in-chief of Arktos for several years. I came upon it rather by chance, as a matter of fact, as I think many of us do. I have the sense that there are a great many lost and wandering in today's society who just stumble around until they happen to stumble over the right root sticking out of the ground, and that's essentially what happened to me. So as soon as I found Arktos, I volunteered to lend my services to the cause, and from there, things have been upward and onward. So Arktos is a small publishing house. It's located in Europe, but it obviously treats of concerns which range across the board from Europe to the United States to Australia, essentially the entirety of what we might call the Eurosphere. We have a number of different schools of thought to which we dedicate the majority of our literature, and these include things such as traditionalism, along the lines of Julius Evola, the fourth political theory of Alexander Dugin, the new right of Alain de Benoit and Guillaume Faye, and we have also books dedicated to the American alt-right. Our philosophy of publishing is essentially to grant a forum to ideas which do not receive the attention that they should in the mainstream, and very often are closed off from entry into the mainstream, and in many cases even from speaking one's mind these days can be a difficult enough affair in many cases. We are dedicated to opposing globalism, which is, as Jared mentioned, will be certainly a topic of some concern for our conversation this evening. And in order to do so, we are interested in anyone who is willing to give a new perspective on the present globalist society, on the problems that are confronting liberalism as a political and social order, and more generally speaking, on the problems that are confronting the contemporary West, particularly those books, those articles, those thinkers, those speakers who do so with an eye toward providing alternatives or possible solutions which we can begin to consider going ahead, since these are very urgently required in our present state.
So yes, on globalism, this is going to weave through our discussion today.
Indeed.
But this is an admittedly broad question, so it might be something we return to and keep fleshing out. But if you can begin with what your assessment is of the general instincts behind globalism, what kind of possesses someone to take up that ideology, and what are its aims? What is the beast that we are up against, since Arktos' very slogan is making anti-globalism global?
And it is a complicated beast that we're up against. I'm tempted to say that it's a kind of hydra, if not, in fact, many different beasts, insofar as there are many, many different motivations which go into producing the phenomenon which we call globalism. There are many different actors with many different aims that they are pursuing. And it's, to my mind, an open question, as a matter of fact, whether this single word actually encompasses a single creature, or if rather there are many different elements involved in it, which in some cases conflict with one another, in some cases even are combating one another, albeit in many cases unconsciously, in order to establish various different kinds of control or authority. So one way of approaching this is simply to begin to isolate and identify the various elements which go into producing this thing called globalism. I think that probably the most obvious element is what one might call neoliberalism, essentially this outgrowth of liberalism, which is strongly market favorable. It wants open markets on a global scale so that it can encourage the movement of goods and services and individuals and human beings from one corner of the planet to the other, and this toward the purpose, as ever, of establishing a kind of increasing wealth for humankind, the elimination of poverty, the eradication of diseases and illnesses and ailments of a variety of kinds. These are at least its outward claims. This part of globalism, however, tends to be controlled by a small quantity of individuals who tend to be extraordinarily wealthy and extraordinarily ruthless, because we have an economic system which chooses for ruthlessness and for an extreme degree of cleverness. These individuals, who are more or less the ones that we refer to when we use the word elite, for example, have very powerful connections in politics. They have very powerful connections, obviously, in the marketplace, in the economy, and they use their wealth and their influence in order to perpetuate and to expand a system in which they are favored economically, in which they are granted a greater share of profits, a greater share of global control. And that's probably the most interesting of the various groups which are involved today, insofar as they are the ones who are really calling the shots behind the scenes, in my opinion, and they are the ones who are pressing globalism along its present courses. On a lower level, one finds as well individuals who are simply private individuals who are interested in making a decent living, many of whom work abroad or work in international companies. Some of these individuals are inherently decent people, and they simply are trying to get by in their lives, but they recognize that there is a certain economic profit which is to be made for them personally from an increase in global economies, and to that extent they defend and support globalism. There's an ideological element involved as well, and this can be found in many individuals who actually do not profit from globalism. In fact, individuals who are injured by globalism, but nonetheless who support it because they see in it the possibility, again, of eradicating world poverty, of eliminating world diseases, of improving the lot of third world countries and the people who live in third world countries, the general expansion of human rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these very commonplace notions, which nonetheless have a great deal of influence in Western countries today, and to which a great many individuals fall prey for reasons which are rather unobjectionable in and of themselves, so only that these people buy hook, line, and sinker exactly what they're told by the higher-ups, and in consequence they don't perceive the true consequences of globalism and the true way in which globalism is not at all interested, at the end of the day, in human equality or in the improvement of the economic well-being of humankind. And I think finally, above all of this, there's also a kind of philosophical, let's say, shell to globalism. You might even call it the core of globalism, which has produced globalism through a radical shift in the underlying philosophies of Western societies, of the West as a whole, beginning as far back as 500 years, and essentially in the period which we call modernity. And so, I mean, these are some of the, some of the interlocking categories which produce this thing called globalism. So it's a complicated beast. It's my suspicion that it's more of a hydra than anything, and it has a singular body which can be assaulted, but that doesn't stop the heads from battling it out with one another.
You said something to the effect that lower level people may be doing this or going along with it out of these benevolent aims, but that perhaps the people behind it don't share those aims, and they're just using this as a husk for maybe a more sinister agenda. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that the agenda for these individuals very often boils down to simple economics. We've produced a kind of ruling class which is obsessed with money and is very good at getting money. This has parallels in the past, but it's relatively unheard of that there should be a group of individuals who are given such an enormity of influence and power merely on the basis of their having made a ton of money. This is a novelty to our day, particularly the extent to which it has been rooted within our societies thanks to our modern technology. Now, the question then becomes, if that's an adequate analysis of the situation, and I think in many cases it is, the question becomes what best serves the interests of these individuals. And what best serves the interests of these individuals is open borders, because that produces an unending stream of labor, of human mobility, which can be moved around the face of the globe in order to feed the hungers of whatever corner of the globe one pleases. This produces the possibility to make a profit, make incredible earnings off of this movement of human beings on a variety of different economic levels, not simply on the level of hiring these individuals to do basic jobs, as is often claimed by our politicians. These individuals are coming in order to do jobs that white Americans don't want to do, or that Europeans don't want to do, or what have you, but also on higher levels as well, because with this mobility, there's an opening for foreign investments, there's an opening for foreign developments, there's an opening for also even human trafficking, which is a big problem here in Europe right now. And all of these different elements play a role in this. I think with many of these individuals, and you can read some of the writings of these people, like George Soros, for example, has written extensively on his view of what should happen with the world. And they seem to be aiming for a relatively clear social order, which would be a global social order in which borders not only no longer exist, but have no reason to exist, in which humanity has been reduced and de-ethnified, deculturized to the point that it no longer has any defining characteristics on the level of groups, and rather we're all simply consumers who live with one another in a state of more or less tranquility and harmony. This is the idea, at least. We don't have any inherent attachment to our soil and any inherent attachment to our religions, because there would be no more religions in this kind of super state. We have no more attachment to our families, to our heritage, because all of these differences have been slowly eroded and finally completely eradicated, completely annihilated. The consequence of this would be an ideal world for those individuals who are interested in making money and using money to establish control over things, because what's left at that point are simply consumers. We're an enormous colony, a global colony of ants dedicated to wandering about, eating things, and carrying them back with us to the den. So I think that on the higher level, let's say the higher echelon of this group of movers and shakers, we have this kind of a goal in sight: the establishment of a one world government, a single world government, a homogeneous world state, in which differences have been eradicated, the human being has been reduced to a consumer or a laborer, and from this, essentially an enormous race of slaves has been produced, which these individuals can use to their own purposes.
What's your sense through history, and particularly our European history, of course, of this notion of the elites that you just spoke of? The last two episodes of this show, we spoke to Mamirs Brunner last week and a woman named Laura Lee Scaife the week prior. That particular episode was about her reading of Lord of the Rings as a metamyth for European peoples. And both of those episodes touched on this idea that someone who might hear you speaking on a superficial level would push back and say, well, there's always been corrupt leaders, right? But there are certainly times in European history, Germanic tribes, and even sacred kingship, where it wasn't this kind of absolute control, this kind of despotic rule is not as common in European societies. And also, as you were indicating, there was a little bit more to what made someone, quote unquote, elite than just the ability to, say, be clever with their investments and make money on derivatives of derivatives of derivatives. And just because, no matter how you did it, you have a lot of zeros in your bank account, that you're now someone that, oh, everyone looks up to. Especially, I would caution our young men not to fall for that kind of trap. So there were character traits as well, your true nobility, courage, and character, and things like that. Do you believe that those traits, in particularly the European peoples, are why we are being targeted, and why particularly European ethnicity is under such scrutiny and attack?
There's some excellent points in that, Jared, and I agree entirely with the kind of overview that you've given. There are a couple of questions there, so I think I'll begin with the last one first. The question of why we are being targeted is a complicated one. I think that there is a tendency to assume that we are being targeted out of a kind of hatred for Europeans, or from those who derive from European stock. And there's an element of this which is clear in the speeches of many contemporary politicians, including, unfortunately, European and American politicians who simply despise themselves for whatever reason. But beyond that, I think that there is also a way in which we are being targeted simply because we are the producers of this enormous abundance. We are the inventors of capitalism as a system, of liberalism as a social and political order. We are at the eye of the hurricane, as it were, and simply as a consequence of that, everything tends to be centered on us. Immigration is a simple example where it's clearly evident how Western societies function as a kind of magnet or a center of gravity, which attracts people from all over the globe on account of their material abundance and their material wealth. It therefore becomes necessary to, if one desires to produce this kind of society in which there are no differences, no distinctions between human beings, it's obvious that one would begin then at that center. That's a natural place to begin. I do not believe that they intend to, establish a worldwide Africa or a worldwide India or anything of the kind. They want to eradicate all of these differences. Now, the question of the Europeans is particular, however. It's special in a certain sense because we are targeted in ways that no other ethnicity, no other nation, no other people is targeted. And I think that this does come down at a certain point, at least in many cases, to a question of what our native virtues are and what they always have been. The very same things that led us to produce this incredible chaos in which we're living also are responsible for a great many marvelous inventions, a great many absolutely incredible feats throughout the course of history. And this will in us, this ability in us to, at a certain point in time, we had brought the entire globe to heel, despite the fact that Europe is a very, very small portion of the globe compared to other regions, and is even not as rich in minerals and things of this kind. Nonetheless, it was able to do as much as this. This indicates that there is something peculiar within the psyche of Europeans, and this peculiarity, I think, does not jive well with the kind of world order that these individuals are attempting to establish. It's clear that a people which is dedicated to a high level of individualism, to give a single example, or which is capable of very clearly and deeply analyzing the political and social situation of the day at hand. A person like that is dangerous to any kind of world order which is based on a fundament of consensus. So it's normal that an individual like that has to be either neutralized, isolated, or else persecuted in some way. And ideally, individuals like that would be bred out of existence. And I think that that's part of what we're seeing. So that would be to answer your latter question. The question of the elites was your first question. And that also is a complicated question. It's obvious that at any moment in history, at any moment in time, there is always this ever-present possibility of political corruption. There have always been bad rulers, and there always will be bad rulers. So it's very important, I think, to attempt to distinguish what is peculiar to our time, because there are peculiarities to our time which differentiated very clearly from the past. One of these is simply the fact that we have, again, established a certain, let's say, mesh through capitalism, through liberalism, a kind of strainer, if you will, but a strainer in reverse, which is dedicated not to finding the most quality human beings, as our ridiculous notion of the meritocracy would have it, but rather to finding the worst of human beings, the human beings who are most willing and most able to sell their souls for mammon. These are human beings who will do anything to arrive at positions of power or economic superiority. And the simple proof of that is in the fact that they have arrived where others have not. Because if you have a very ruthless individual, preferably a psychopath who has no interest whatsoever in other human beings and simply wants to look out for his own good, and happens to be also highly intelligent and highly capable, and you set him next to another highly intelligent and highly capable human being who has moral scruples, and you put this into a system of, let's say, laissez-faire economics, a system of open trade, which one is going to rise to the top? I suspect it's going to be the one who is willing to do anything. Consequently, we have arrived at a point at which our rulers tend to be much, much, much worse than they were in the past. Bad rulers in the past were accidental, and what's more, they always emerged, except for in the cases of direct monarchies, absolute monarchies. They tended to emerge within the context of aristocracies. These aristocracies were dedicated, for all of their flaws and all of their failings, they were dedicated to a certain idea of rulership. They understood their responsibilities, and they attempted to impress the gravity of those responsibilities on subsequent generations. The children of an aristocracy are always raised with a certain idea of duty. That's an idea which is completely lacking today. It is completely lacking in our ruling orders today. That idea of duty is not sufficient to constrain a human being, and it is not sufficient to eradicate corruption. But it is sufficient to put a strain on both of those and to contain them to some extent. We have nothing of the kind today. We are living truly in a kind of Wild West situation, but unfortunately without the good cowboy who draws his gun faster than the bad one.
Well said. I wish I could have been paying more attention to all of this great conversation. I've been kind of in and out of everything you all have been saying. It's been really scintillating so far. And hello to everyone. Am I a little blurry right now? I've been working on making this stream technically work in the background, and we have received some super chats. I want folks to know what the super chats that we've had that have come in. I'm looking right now. I see Josh Randall's in there. Lapis is here. Simon Harris is here. Let's see. Does anybody? Good
Mac. The feedback is good.
Yeah, the feedback here is good. Yeah, I'm getting that. Good Mackie says a little blurry but acceptable. Yeah, actually, this was really interesting because the correction, believe it or not, was the other stream that I started that doesn't exist on my dashboard. It is gone. It's magically gone. Although it is visible on my YouTube channel. If you go to it, you'll see that there is a stream, or at least the last time I looked, there was a stream that is not ongoing, that has passed its begin time. That stream does not exist on my end on the dashboard. So it's interesting. As soon as I launched this second stream, suddenly this one began working. So isn't that curious? It's like, well, it looks like they're going to be tenacious today, and they're just going to keep at it. They want this information from John to get out there, and so we might as well give up on screwing this up today. But in the midst of all that, you all out there, I'm so proud of you. Thank you so much. You came through, you jumped in, you let us know that there wasn't any sound. And better yet, and a big message to all of the anti-whites out there who think they're going to stop us from going free. You better think again, because when you begin throwing technical difficulties out our way, if this was intentional, if it's just not a glitch because you have too much equality at your organization, and ladies and gentlemen, remember the MC, that where you have equality, you can't have excellence, and eventually you can't even have competence. So that's one of the MCs we live by, going free. And so this may just be a incompetence over at YouTube that is causing this, things to go wrong, the wheels falling off, as we see across the country with all of the equality that we have. So in answer to that, whether it was just the incompetence of the anti-whites or the malice, we began having people start throwing money at the cause of white well-being. That, you anti-whites out there, that is the response from a healthy and a vibrant, growing community, a community that has a heartbeat and is not just a bunch of ghostly ideas that will float in one window and out the other the next day, and you anti-whites can stop worrying about it. No, this is flesh and blood, and it lives. So we immediately had Ryan Manley, of course, a regular and champion in our rapidly growing community, super chatted on over on Entropy, $2.99, and writing with the feedback that there is no sound, brother. Thank you very much for that. Every dollar will be put to good use in the cause of going free. We have 5, a Peruvian soul from Zero Schizo. Thank you so much, good sir. And writing, no sound here. No sound, but here to support you guys. And then he, what else did you write here? Excalibur, for the British people. I might add a video on it by the weekend. And thoughts on Excalibur. So that's a question to you, John, and we'll get to that in a moment. John, thoughts on Excalibur? And we have
the film, the British film, Arthurian film from the 1980s.
I don't know if he's referencing the movie or the story in general.
I would think it would be the movie, but he can tell us in the regular chat.
Yes, please do tell us in the regular chat. Tag Jared or myself, and we will be sure to clarify that for John so we can get the answer to the question that you would like to have. We also have Syrup doing double duty back again, even in the midst of his busyness that he's engaged in now. Super chatting with £5 and writing, this is 9 words from my writings. Atonement cannot be made for a crime never committed. Well said indeed. We can never make up for the things that we never did. And that's why we have to get off the pages of the anti-white narrative and write our own stories. Well said, Syrup. Thank you for the £5. And we have, let's see, that might be it. Still trying to wrap things up as it was. Looks like we had Ryan Manley on super chatting. It might have been a super chat on because Entropy either went down because of something I did, but I got it back up. So okay, so it looks like Ryan Manley's, now that I check, Ryan Manley's super chat was on YouTube and was just displayed on Entropy as well, as they are wont to do. So thank you very much for that. Super chat, Ryan. Everyone, we just had Daughter of Albion, a great guest, and thank you for being here. Super chat with £5. As John read, any of the amazing Guillaume Fay? If so, what does he make of their predictions for Europe? So we're going to find out about Zero Schizo's question, and we will toss that to you first. John, please take it away.
So first, the question regarding Guillaume Fay and his thoughts on the future of Europe. I'll take that as a yes. So yeah, I have definitely read Guillaume Fay. In fact, Arktos has recently published Guillaume Fay's last book, the last book that he completed before his untimely death. And it is available at present. I was the editor of it, so I had the opportunity, to my great joy, to read it before it was even out on the shelves. Guillaume Fay has some extremely relevant things to say about Europe, and he says them with his usual degree of trenchancy and sharpness in his last book as well. The idea that we are rapidly approaching a state in which there will be a convergence of catastrophes, essentially a point in time in which not just a single thing will go catastrophically wrong, but an entire group of things could potentially go catastrophically wrong, all of them intertwining with one another and producing an unprecedented state of affairs. This, in a way, is a very devastating and depressing point of view, insofar as it suggests that we have to go much, much lower than we've gotten before we can come out of all of this. But in a way, it's also a hopeful point of view. And I think that Fay always saw some kind of hope in it because he had a warrior spirit to him and tended to view things from that perspective. Now, his views shifted to some extent, I think, over the course of his life. When you read his earlier works, for example, Convergence of Catastrophe, he focused a lot on some of the possible disasters that might come out of our economic system, out of the environmental state of affairs, out of even the political system, leaving aside questions like immigration and ethnic conflict. In his recent book, he has focused almost entirely on the question of ethnic conflict in Europe. And it seems to be the case that he viewed that as being the most pointed and immediate threat to the Europeans. This is a book which focuses primarily on France and extends its view from France outward to encompass the whole of Europe. And the book has been published under the English title of Ethnic Apocalypse. His point in this book is that there's a civil war coming to Europe, and this civil war will not be like previous civil wars because it will include an extra component, which one might call an ethnic component. This involves a degree of religious disagreement, a degree of religious conflict. It involves a degree of a conflict between different customs in different ways. It involves between different peoples who have never lived together in one and the same place in the way that they are doing now in European cities. And I think that there is, unfortunately, a great deal to be said for Fai's predictions. The state of contemporary European cities in particular, urban areas, is extremely, extremely volatile on account of the density of the foreign populations that live in there, and the degree to which they have begun to make demands upon the political systems under which they are living. This is, again, an unprecedented state of affairs in the history of Europe. The only analog that Europe has ever seen has been with the Islamic invasions of the past. But that was a different state. That was also a different state of affairs insofar as Europe was dealing at that point in time with a clear enemy, which was, invading European soil and taking European territories. This is a historical fact that the Islamic armies managed to get almost to the very heart of Europe before they were finally stopped and repulsed. The present situation is much, much more complicated because these individuals don't come in the form of an invasion. They don't come in the form of an aggressive army hostile to Europeans. They come in the form of immigrants, and immigrants can include all kinds of people. They can include individuals who simply want to, get ahead in life and are interested in finding a job. They can include individuals who are coming here with the explicit intent of establishing communities dedicated to their ways, their customs, their religions, etc. They can include terrorists. They can include individuals, that is to say, who really are hostile to Europe and really can be regarded as enemy soldiers. This is an enormously confusing state of affairs. This, in conditions like this, it is unclear who the enemy is. It is unclear where the limits of potential war might be drawn, where they would fall. If violence did indeed spark in such a way as to spread, to conflagrate beyond the borders of a very small altercation or a small community, and began to spread to an entire city, and from there to an entire nation, the consequences could be devastating, and it's very, very uncertain how that would play out. Fai dedicates a lot of time to predicting some of the possibilities, the ways that this might happen in his latest book. Obviously, his goal, as all of our goal, is to stop that from coming about. We are, all of us, interested in stopping a war like that from ever having to take place. And unfortunately, one of the blind spots of the global order, particularly on the lower levels, the ideological level, is in failing to recognize this as a necessary consequence of the intermixing of peoples of vastly different ways, different beliefs, different heritage, different pasts, and different futures. And so it's very likely that we're going to be seeing much more violence on the European peninsula in time to come.
John, let me jump in really quick because I want you to add to your explanation there. Daughter of Albion was also asking, I missed this, and this is, I don't know who this is. This is probably a French name, so it's probably pronounced something like Renan Camus.
Yeah.
And if I can make an ugly face with my mouth there, she's asking about that author as well. And I don't know how that will inform your answer that you're giving here, but please continue.
I'm really not equipped to speak of Camus because I've actually never read any of his stuff. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to pass on that half of the question. He is mentioned in Fai's books, though.
Oh, okay. And then the clarification was on, for Zero Schizo, was on Excalibur as a representation of the British Dasein. Is that what we wrote? Is that what we found out, Jared?
Heidegger's Dasein, yes.
Dasein, all right. Well, in the first place, greetings to Zero Schizo. who I actually happen to know. So thanks very much for the question. And now we're touching on the deeper levels of mythology here with the British psyche. So there's probably a lot that could be said about this. The myth of Excalibur would suggest, and one thing that immediately comes to mind, it would suggest that there is something within the psyche of British people which would incline them toward looking for a kind of leader, who is destined to lead a people out of dark times. I mean, the entire myth of King Arthur is constructed around this sort of historical shift in which there is chaos in the land. There are a number of divided communities, divided nations warring against one another. And the once and future king, the true king, arises from this, and taking Excalibur, proves his worth, proves his bloodline, proves his right to rule. Obviously, in our present day and age, one can't hope for anything like Excalibur, and the ballot box is a poor substitute. But nonetheless, there might be some element there of a desire to see this kind of political reemergence, this kind of rebirth of a nation from out of a chaotic and complicated time. And there are obvious parallels with the state of the world today, in which there are numerous wars which for now surround the Eurosphere rather than existing within the Eurosphere. Within the Eurosphere itself, we've really had an epic of unprecedented peace, but these wars could easily spread to our states. And the conflict that we are seeing arise within Europe, certainly within Great Britain, but also in every nation of Europe, is even a kind of conflict between the native Europeans, to the extent that they have radically different views about how to go forward in our time, what kind of political order should be established, how to vote in democratic elections, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable on the level of the behavior and the policy of our leaders, all manner of things which do contribute to a growing tension and a growing division between the peoples. And this, obviously, at a time of great vulnerability like our own, is enormously hurtful to us. It is enormously injurious. We have to find some way, insofar as this is possible, of overcoming this kind of divisiveness. And the tale of King Arthur certainly provides an indication of a will within the historical European peoples toward political unity, toward social unity, toward uniting under a common sword and a common crown. And if something like that could be recovered today through some kind of unforeseeable political event, I think that would be greatly to our favor.
I would add that on the Excalibur question, if it's something about just waiting for a leader, that could be detrimental. But there's a lot of richness there, because if I'm remembering this correctly, people often confuse the sword and the stone with Excalibur. There's two swords in that story. When Arthur's a young boy, he pulls a sword from the stone to first prove that he's the rightful king. But that sword, in fact, is not Excalibur. Excalibur comes later in the story, when I believe the Lady of the Lake comes up with the hand from the lake, and that is, you think of the lake, the feminine, the unformed, but also the natural, something from our folk, from our bloodline, coming back and giving us something, a boon, giving us an energy. But the sword is also a technology at the time. It's a weapon of war, of course. So it actually dovetails nicely with what I was about to ask John anyway, touches on something you were saying, John, about the urban and the European peoples. One of the books I've read, and you spoke about 5 from Arktos, is archaeofuturism. That term has really become part of our lexicon now. And I think rightly so, because, just to say it quickly, but people that know this show and know me know that I like to find these threads a lot and tie them together. Is a lot of the key of what's going on in the European world is that I think we need to reharmonize kind of dual drives that we have. And one of those is reverence for nature and stewardship with nature on the one hand, but also that drive of the will and conquering and learning new things and flying to the stars, the technological advance. And that perhaps what we're seeing now, that low-level conversations sometimes swing too much to one side or the other. Well, because we've become too technological, we all need to go back to living in the forest. And while there is truth that things need to be rebalanced, we're never going to lose that drive to master nature, to know more, to have that conquering spirit. So I'm curious as to how you kind of frame that harmony. And I mean, I believe cities aren't inherently bad. There might always be centers of commerce and arts and culture. I don't know if it makes sense to have museums just randomly scattered about along the countryside rather than have them be concentrated. Although I think maybe there could be some interesting ways to meld the agrarian with that kind of high culture more. Perhaps that's a long way off and it's something to just muse about. But yeah, your thoughts on the urban lifestyle, the mechanized bugman lifestyle, what that's done to us, and again, walking that fine line of where our instincts reside with the technology, but also being close to the land.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it's one of the great questions facing us. The problem of technology is enormously formidable in our time, because, as you point out, one can neither live with it nor without it. On the one hand, if we were to forego technology, which is also in and of itself simply inconceivable, I mean, a sort of large-scale Luddite movement cannot be imagined. But supposing there were such a thing, and all of us in some Western nation got together and decided we just had to cut it off and stop with technology and go back to living in the land in some kind of more fundamental way, some kind of an agrarian lifestyle or something of the kind, it's clear that a nation like that could not long survive in the midst of superpowers that are dedicated to harnessing particularly military technologies, but also technologies that would provide the possibility for them to excel in the social sphere. And so in consequence, it's necessary to harness technology. Technology, to my mind, is one of these things that might have best been left in the bag, honestly. I mean, modern technology. I think that probably it's one of the things that could potentially destroy us, in my opinion. I do think that we've reached that level. And this is not merely in the question of nuclear warheads, although obviously that's part of it. But there are a great many ways in which our technology could potentially ruin us or ruin the planet to the extent that we can no longer live on it. And they are growing greater and greater the more that we progress with our technology. In consequence of this, we are confronted with a situation in which we have released an enormous power, a power which in pragmatic and physical terms is greater than any power the world has ever seen. And we have given this power to the hands of irresponsible men who are incapable of being responsible. That is an inherently hazardous situation, and it's one that we have to find some way of coming to terms with. Ideally, there would be a ruling class which was incapable, which was able to draw firm limits around the public use of technology, and which could permit scientific research to the extent that it needed to do so for military purposes or for the purposes of social development. Even in a case like that, the question of technology is not resolved, because, as is known, scientific research requires a degree of openness. It requires a kind of open society. I think that a lot of us who are confronting modernity and attempting to come to terms with modernity neglect to look at clearly enough at the fact that the Enlightenment and the birth of science are coeval. They happened at the same time. They are, in many cases, the same thing. It's the same thing that was emerging. And liberalism and science have certain definite parallels to one another. It is very difficult to try to imagine on a pragmatic level a society which is not dedicated to liberalism and yet which provides adequate space to scientific research. So this would be one of the great balances that a potential future ruling class capable of responsibility would have to manage in some way or another. Our immediate question, of course, is not how in some hypothetical future to constrain technology, but how to live with the kind of technology that we've already produced. And this, to some of us, seems to be easier than to others of us. There are many individuals who seem perfectly at home in our super technological world and have no problems whatsoever adopting the latest iPhone or the latest form of the computer or the latest gadget or the latest program, and not only adapting that program into their lives, but adapting themselves to that program. Others tend to be reticent or hesitant or skeptical of technology, and they want to limit themselves, to distance themselves from it to some extent. I happen to fall in that group, but at the same time, we are speaking internationally via an internet which provides that possibility for us, via a system of computers and things that did not exist 10 years ago. This would not have been possible 10 years ago. Now it is, and we're using it. We're making the best of it. I think the same thing has to be done with the cities as well. The urban situation obviously incorporates a greater degree of technology, and this both for good and bad, because increased technology provides as well an increased possibility of governmental surveillance, governmental controls. It obviously augments the possibility of corrupt leaders to put restraints and chains on their citizens to the point that they even make slaves of them. I mean, it's not that difficult at this point to imagine a kind of actual brave new world scenario in which a society has been built and structured around the basic potential that technology presently gives us, and provides in that way for a thoroughgoing tyranny. This is a possibility, and this also has to be confronted. Now, to live in a city, I think, brings you closer into contact with that kind of a possibility, because obviously if you live in a city, you are being watched on a continual basis. So there's always the possibility that someone is overhearing what you're saying. There's always the possibility that there's a camera somewhere which is filming you no matter what you happen to be doing. If you live in the countryside, to some extent, at least in certain parts of the world, that's not so great of a concern, although even Google Maps knows where my house is, and I'm in the middle of nowhere practically. So I don't know. Technology is a double-edged sword at best, and in many cases, I think it tends toward destruction much more than toward positive results. And I say that fully cognizant of the miracles that it has brought in terms of medicine and industry.
That's a fantastic answer. And now that I've got everything running properly, I think I should be clearer to you all now. Am I? Good. Let's get started. What have I missed? Only kidding, ladies and gentlemen. If you could, though, please, I'd like to know where, to all of you who are listening right now, where did you stop hearing me in the beginning of the show? Where did I cut out? What were the last things that you heard me say? I want to remind everybody that, we just had a couple of super chats coming in right away, and I will get to those in a moment. But I was going to remind folks that if you have questions and you want to get them answered, you can just ask them in the chat. You will up your chances of your question being answered or your statement being read if you tag Jared or myself. And of course, when you super chat, all super chat questions and statements are going to be read. If you decide to say something objectionable, I will reword it so that you sound a bit silly. That's a promise. I will say that if you want to super chat, you can do so here on YouTube at 33%. On Entropy at 15%. Their link is in the description immediately below the video. And then a little further down, you will find the familiar alternative at 4% if you want to super chat. All of those options are up and available right now, as well as others that you will find in the description below. And what else did I have here? We have over on Entropy, we have a poll going. And the question is quite simple. Are you enjoying the stream thus far? And so far, it looks like the answer is yes. So we're doing well over on Entropy. We also have some questions that I would like to read from Entropy. The first one is, let's see if I can read it from here. This is from Yonash asking John, why do you think the post-communist countries of Europe are today better off than the West? And will they make it to the future? That's one question, and I want you just to hold that in your mind, John, if you could, because we have another one from Odin Allfather asking for your opinion from a publisher's standpoint. What are your thoughts on the new Israeli Bible? And of course, whether or not you know of it or have looked into it at all. Once you give these answers, I'll quickly go back to these super chats, and then Jared will continue the show. The floor is yours, sir.
Excellent. All right. Well, that is a great question about the Eastern European bloc and why it has remained to some extent immune to many of the acutest of the diseases which seem to be plaguing Western Europe and certainly the United States. I think that there are a number of explanations which can be adduced to explain this. And they probably all of them have some element of truth to them. I think on the one hand, it's certainly the case that there having been beneath communist, let's say, protectorateship in this case, defended them from the disease of liberalism to the extent that liberalism was not able to take root in them also on a psychological and social level. It was very, very strongly contested and strongly repulsed by the communist regime. And the consequence of that, obviously, is that the people did not take to it as much. There was not as much propaganda in its favor. The political order did not tend in that direction. And therefore, they remained to that extent excluded from that entire development. So that's one possibility, and I think that certainly is an element which has played a role here, particularly in the Eastern European bloc. However, it also bears noting that the Eastern European bloc, to some extent, has adopted liberal policies and liberal governments, albeit to a lesser extent than Western Europe in particular. The immigration question is hotly contested, but there are a great many other social questions which are more or less moving in the liberal direction within those countries. Another peculiarity here is that there are countries that were within the Western part of Europe, which also maintain a degree of independence, and Italy is an example of these. The Italians do not succumb to the same extent as Northern Europeans in particular to the myths and the dogmas of contemporary liberalism, which begs the question if there's some element, some secondary element also within the Eastern European bloc, which promotes in them a certain kind of resistance to this. And one thing that can be seen in all of these countries is a degree of ethnic integrity. There's a degree of respect for and reverence for custom. All of these countries, most of these countries tend to be Catholic. They tend to adhere, at least in terms of the polls, and when one asks a person on the street, are you Catholic? They tend to say that they are. So there's a degree of religiosity which is lacking to a large extent in Northern European countries and also in many parts of the United States. And so a secondary question might be, why is it that they have preserved that kind of regard and respect for their own customs, and why was that lost in other parts of the Eurosphere? This is a very difficult question to answer, and I'm afraid I don't have any adequate answers to it. It's something that I give a lot of thought to, and I think it's something that we should all be attempting to work out and to debate. I do think that a lot of this comes down in the end to questions of the way of being of a given people. And I'll give an example of what I mean by this. In Italy, it has been said by a very keen observer of Italian politics and society that the basic political unit, the fundamental political unit, is the family. This holds true as well in many parts of Eastern Europe. There is a regard for, a reliance on the family as the basic social and political unit, which was not as strong in other parts of Europe. Obviously, the family has always been a central part of European identity and heritage. In America, the family has always been historically very central. But this kind of division of the family from the social order, to such an extent that one is willing to do things for one's family that might fall outside the boundaries of the law, that might offend against one's neighbors or against the neighboring city. This kind of really basic tribalism almost, or nepotism, as that comes from the Italian nepotismo. So there's this sense in which the family has been preserved. And because the family has been preserved, it has been possible to pass on traditions. It has been possible to pass on customs and a respect for customs and traditions, which is not possible in a society in which the family begins to decay, in which divorce rates are elevated, in which single-parent families begin to propagate, and in which there is no basic atom of the social unit composed of a variety of individuals who are capable of actually transmitting these things from generation to generation. So I suspect that part of the resistance of these nations actually has to do with this fact here. There are other customary questions which could be called into play here as well, and which indicate other reasons for which they might have remained relatively immune. But I think that you really have to get down to the level of details and begin looking at what it is about these peoples on a basic level, on a day-to-day level, which permitted them a degree of liberty in the face of liberalism.
Well stated. Let me jump in with these super chats really quick, and we will get back on course. And folks, if you are on Entropy, you are able to upvote questions that you would like to see answered. So those questions will rise to the top, and they are also more likely to end up being asked of Jared, myself, and our guest. So we have Josh Randall super chatting with $10. Thank you very much for the kind investment to White Wellbeing, my good friend. $10, and writing, press 1 if you're head over heels about being white. Well, damn straight. Thank you very much for that, Josh. Zero Schizo back again with 5 Peruvian Soul. Any plans of Arktos expanding to Latin America? So we can follow up Faye's advice and bring up colo-futurism. Also, any thoughts on DeGrelle's book? We'll have you answer that, John, and then Jared will get back on track.
All right, so the short answer is yes, absolutely. Arktos is looking to expand in many, many different parts of the Eurosphere. That includes South America, that includes Australia. We obviously have we have readers in these parts of the world, and we have books that are related to them to a certain extent. But as far as actually developing a devoted literature to these parts of the globe, I think that it's absolutely necessary. I think that all of us across the face of the planet are fighting the same fight at the end of the day. And the extent to which we are able to organize a unity amongst ourselves and to make connections, even like the present one, to discuss ideas, to discuss possibilities, and above all, to understand that we are all in the same plight is absolutely fundamental to our being able to escape from it. Because if we break into fragmented pieces and begin to divide the globe into parcels and to separate from one another at a moment like this, that could easily mean the destruction of the European peoples, because they become very easy at that point to pick off by the great powers that might have an interest in doing so. So that's the long of it, I suppose. Obviously, we are constrained by resources, by time constraints. Arktos at present is one of the few publishing houses which dedicates itself to the propagation of literature like this. Consequently, we have a very large workload, which is in a certain way actually not so great insofar as it suggests that there's a kind of vacuum presently. And there's so much work that it would be good to have many collaborators on projects like these, which would permit us to expand into new literature, new categories of literature, new places on the planet. We've been growing, so with any hope, that will come about as well.
Glad to hear about that. I want to actually switch gears. I'm going to jump ahead to a question that we had a little further down. And that is, since you were speaking about technology, John, that would be about your book, a little about your book, The New Prometheans. And it's especially interesting because I'd like to facilitate a conversation between you and Jason and these different ways that this term Promethean, Prometheus has been used recently. Obviously, we know Giorgiani has used it as well. Yes. Jason has his book, Prometheus Rising, which is a book within a book in his large book, Born Guilty. It's contained within that. It's kind of a mythopoetic piece. But of course, we do know the myth of Prometheus and that it is related to what we were talking about earlier, those temptations of knowing the light and having the light of technology and knowledge, the knowledge that creates the technology. But why don't you begin, well, really by telling us anything you'd like about this new book. I just became aware of it in the days prior to this show, and then maybe we can get a little more in detail about this term Prometheus and speak about technology. And I'm sure we'll circle back to globalism at some point.
Yeah, in a way, we never left it in a certain sense, but nonetheless, yeah, absolutely, by all means. So my book actually just recently came out. It's only been on the market now for a little more than a week, I believe. So it's no wonder that you hadn't heard of it. But it is an attempt to provide a gesture in the direction of contributing toward the philosophical underpinnings of what one might call the new right. So at present, we're at a very interesting political moment in the West. There are a number of different ways that we can understand this political moment, but one way of considering it is in the fragmentation and the breakdown of the traditional political spectrum, which we've been living beneath for the past several centuries. The traditional left-right political spectrum, which has been perfectly adequate for almost all purposes, with very few exceptions, up until the present day. In the present day, it begins to become inadequate, and there are many causes for this. But what's interesting about this is that it suggests that the political spectrum itself was not an adequate representation of the full political possibilities open to us. There are other political possibilities which lie beyond that spectrum. That spectrum is a modern production. It at best encapsulates all of the modern possibilities for political being, for social and political being. The propagation in recent times of terms like the new right, like neo-reactionism, like even neoconservatism or neoliberalism indicate this shift in our political understanding and the inadequacy of our prior way of viewing politics. This opens up a world of possibilities, and the question which emerges immediately is, what do these possibilities contain and how are they relevant to our present situation? What kinds of potential can we find in the land that lies beyond the traditional political spectrum? Now, the emergence of the new right in particular is interesting on this score, because the new right is notoriously difficult to locate on the traditional political scale. One can locate on the traditional political scale communism. One can locate on the traditional political scale liberalism, neoliberalism, capitalism, even at a stretch, things like fascism. But it is very difficult to locate the new right on the political scale, because it seems to take elements from all parts of that political scale. So my book is dedicated in part to attempting to understand why there's that complexity behind it and how we can understand that complexity, which is to say, what possibilities does this novel political situation open up to us? Another way of thinking about this is that we have entered into what can truly be considered a democratic time. And I know that I'll probably get a lot of argumentation on this, because people very rightly point out that we're not living in democracies, that the idea of a democracy is essentially a kind of myth which is put over a very undemocratic political order. And I understand those arguments and I agree with them completely. But we're living in democracies insofar as the traditional form of contemporary political states was republicanism. We are supposed to be living under constitutional republics. We have entered into a time in which it is possible to completely ignore, to overlook, in many cases even to attack standing constitutions and standing laws through rabble-rousing and through democratic process. This is the spirit of democracy. Anyone who looks for, a kind of idealized democracy in which the people have their way and there's a sort of happy liberal order and everyone lives happily ever after, in my opinion, are looking really for a chimera. Such a thing does not exist. Democracy in its actual working, in its actual way of being, is an inherently unstable system. It is a system which has no fundamental respect for or regard for the law of the land. So, I mean, this is, in America in particular, this represents a radical shift in our political viewpoint, because America is built on the respect for the law and the law of the land. Democracies have no such thing. They are willing to do away with the law of the land if necessary, and to put in its place the will of the people. The will of the people, of course, is a very nebulous concept and can be easily be manipulated by the powers that be, by politicians, by the so-called elite, by any number of working figures toward the establishment of a new political regime. Because democracy, as I said, is unstable. It is a waypoint, of a way of getting from here to there. We are here, and the question is, where is there? Where are we going, and what can we make of that future? The political elite, the globalists, I mean, to bring us back there once again, Jared, the globalists are tending us in the direction of a single world order, which would replace democracy with a so-called open society, which is in fact a tyrannically closed society from which there is no escape. There are other possibilities open to us now, however, other political possibilities, and my book is an attempt to explicate some of the aspects of a new potential political vision for the future, which exceeds merely, a kind of political treatise, but also attempts to establish these things on a groundwork of custom and culture and more generalized understanding of the world. the figure of Prometheus comes into this because Prometheus is classically the great defier of the gods. Now, this can be taken in a number of different senses, and I think some of them are actually probably unhealthy insofar as, I think that Prometheus, particularly in early modernity, in the Enlightenment, was taken as a figure of rejection of authority, rejection of tradition, and the establishment of a kind of new and brighter Enlightenment future founded on rationality, etc., etc. And this, I think, is actually an error with respect to the myth. It's a misinterpretation of the myth, and more than anything else, it establishes a kind of damaging and deleterious myth in its place. But Prometheus has been arising, as you note, in many different contexts today. There seems to be a renewed respect for Prometheus and also for a number of other mythological figures, even from more contemporary mythology like Faust. In fact, Faust and Prometheus are often identified with one another, which I think is actually probably a mistake. But one way or another, the idea behind this is that we are looking for something which symbolizes our spirit. And the Titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humankind, the Titan who is responsible, as Aeschylus says, for giving all arts to humankind, all arts traced back to Prometheus. This is a very, very significant representative of our people, of our culture, of our ways of being and doing, because it indicates this kind of attitude of exploration that you've pointed to, Jared. This kind of will to look things in the face, to look nature in the face, and to command nature as well, which can be a very dangerous desire, as I've attempted to point out. But nonetheless, it is obviously referring to something within us, and it resonates with us, which I think is an excellent sign, because we are in need of a mythological founding precisely like this. So I for one, find it extraordinarily promising that this figure has begun to pop up in even some of the most unexpected of places. And we recently published a book in German, as a matter of fact, which also had Prometheus in the title. So this is a common theme right now, and I'd be absolutely pleased as well to hear about No White Guilt's book on the same theme. So
I'll happily share. In fact, I should have sent you a book when we get off the show here today. I will send you a copy of Born Guilty so that you can have your own and take a look at Prometheus Rising. It really is something that is quite different from what I'm sure you read normally, because it is mythopoetic and it's written in a very specific style that once you have it and see it, I think there are a few who in the audience who have read it and maybe they would like to comment and can speak to the writing style that I use in that portion of Born Guilty. But I essentially resurrected the god Prometheus, and he brings with him in Prometheus Rising the same attributes that we see in the historical figure, but to those attributes I add a whole nother list of things. He becomes the creator of almost all things, but specifically our creator as Western kind. And he embodies all of our strongest and weakest points, and he struggles. And we see on many levels ourselves in him. There are a great many admonitions. The entirety of the book is intended to serve in the same way that that mathematics serves to understand our physical universe and yet is not our physical universe. Prometheus Rising is intended to serve as a way to understand our social universe and our place in that universe. It's a way also to come together. It's a means by which we can come together and at the same time maintain everything that is unique about us in all the ways, all of the different hues. Not just physically, but culturally, etc. And of course, our coming together, our union, what we talk about in Going Free and the White Positive Sphere in the service of white well-being, is a great white ring that circles the globe. When we unite hands as Western kind, presupposes that we are going to not only honor all of these differences, but that we are going to magnify them. So as we've said, we haven't said in a long time, Jared, and so it's worth saying again, that the British will be more British under such a union. You know, the Irish will be more Irish under such a union. Even you break it down even further to the different areas in each of these countries, we will celebrate these differences And the celebration of those differences, the recognition of those differences, presupposes that we come together on that which is the same within all of Western kind, and that is our biosphere. That is what Prometheus gives to us in the story Prometheus Rising, and it is the tie that binds us, even though we end up separating as a people. In that story, there are cataclysms, and different groups go different ways. There are many cataclysms. There's theomachy. There are, I guess, a lot of the places are polyonymous. It's written to be a universe that tracks a narrative from the beginning of time all the way to the present, a universe in which, and this speaks to a super chat that I will read in just a moment, a universe in which I can write a great many more stories that will also be able to teach how we should behave and see each other in our world today, given our challenges today, given our weaknesses today, and how those weaknesses are exploited by our victimizers. So let me read a couple of these super chats, because I know the day is just getting later and later for you, John. We'll start off with a big one over on Entropy, and it was by Lawrence, writing for $50, ladies and gentlemen. If we could please get a round of applause for Lawrence. That is a fantastic investment in the cause of white well-being. Thank you, my good friend. Great show, gents. Keep up the good work, Winston. And then we also have, it looks like this one was on YouTube, NorCal writing with $9.99. Thank you very much, and making a sagacious point. The ethnic identity of peoples are like trees. Without strong roots, both are doomed to fall. Very well said, and thank you for that kind investment. We have Taylor Garza over on Entropy as well. Thank you for being over there, and I think probably the both of you have participated in the poll, and the yes answers are growing. For those of you enjoying the stream, thank you all for those round of applause. And so let's see, where was I? So we had ethnic identity, and we have Taylor Garza with the $5, and asking John, the Scanza Forum is quickly becoming a popular gathering where nationalists from around the world can associate and exchange ideas. Would Arktos consider holding a similar forum every year? Hold on to that question for a moment, John, if you would, and we will get to, I think we have two more super chats. We have Josh Randall super chatting on YouTube with $20. Thank you very much, good sir. Writing, there are two Josh Randalls in this chat, which means we must duel to the death. So there can only be one. Anyway, can you ask if Arktos has any fiction or is planning or to publish any fiction? We need more well-being fiction. And of course, when Josh speaks there about well-being fiction, that's something that I've addressed over the past couple shows, that in the community for white well-being, if we ever shorten that to well-being, we're talking about white well-being. And when we talk about different genre, say, for example, of music, we don't bother saying white well-being rock and roll. We just say well-being rock or well-being poetry, well-being sculpture. And so that's what Josh is saying there when he says well-being fiction. So we have the question about is Arktos going to be holding a similar forum every year to the Scanza Forum? And will Arktos be publishing any fiction? And I will take down the other super chat, and we will get to that in a moment. And Jared, if you did have any questions on or desire any clarification on the discussion about the Prometheus Rising, and John's book, which I really want people to take a look at. We haven't had the opportunity to take a look at it yet. It is so new. First nonfiction book entitled The New Prometheus, which attempts to contribute to the grounding of a serious and integrated new right. It is bound to be very intriguing. I'll pass it over to you, Jared, and to John, so we can get to those questions that we had in the super chats.
Well, why don't we hear from John first? Do you remember? I don't even remember what the super chats were. Maybe you had them.
The first question was on the possibility of Arktos hosting something similar to the Scanza Forum. And in fact, in the past, it has done so with identitarian ideas. It's been some years since we've been able to do so on account of some complications with organizing more than anything else. Arktos' staff is somewhat widely dispersed across the globe. We're a regular globalist operation here at Arktos. And in consequence of that, it makes it difficult to actually sit down and organize something like that. But we've definitely had discussions of the kind, and I have no doubt that we will be doing so in the future. Hopefully not the far too distant future. There are a number of burgeoning organizations, however, which have begun to hold conferences which are well worth paying attention to, particularly in coming years. There was recently, this last weekend, a conference in Germany by Nova Europa, which is a new organization on the question of the ethno-state, and the videos for that I think will be coming online very soon, so that's definitely worth looking into. The other question was on fiction and whether we publish fiction. We absolutely do publish fiction. We have a small collection, but we have been growing it rapidly, particularly this last year, and we have in mind a number of other titles that we're going to be publishing in the coming months. Some of our fiction is... So I'll give you some examples of some specific books that we've published recently. One is by Fenech Soler, who is a fiction writer who has published a number of titles with a variety of publishers, which provide a kind of fictional account of the coming years, the immediate future. And Fenech Soler, I recently had an interview with him as well on our Interregnum podcast on Arktos, is dedicated to this idea of providing a new mythology for the right, which I think is absolutely spot on and absolutely fundamental. And I'm very, very pleased to hear about similar projects happening here as well. This book that's been discussed sounds like an excellent one, and I'll look forward to reading it. Fenech Soler recently published with Arktos a book called Crawl, which looks at the coming years in South Africa. It's a prediction of where that country is going to be in, say, the next decade or so, from the point of view of a number of fictionalized characters who have to deal essentially with the fallout from the breakdown of a society. And Fenech Soler has done very similar things with a variety of Western nations so far, including France and Russia, and we'll be continuing to do this kind of work. So that's one example of the sort of fiction that we publish. Guillaume Fay also has a fiction book under the Arktos title, Archaeofuturism 2.0, in which he provides a number of short stories, which look at potential futures once again. So there's a common theme to a lot of the fiction that we present of what's going to happen in the future, where we're going to be in the coming years, and things of this kind. We also have several books by Tito Perdue, who is an American author.
Fantastic, by the way.
Yeah,
fantastic author. He's a
really
great guy.
is. Yes, indeed. I agree entirely on both counts. He is a delightful, delightful author who writes in a way which, to my mind, is very, very refreshing, insofar as the kind of viewpoint that a healthy person should have is simply presupposed in the book. It's not even the subject matter of the book so much as simply the way that the book is written and framed. It's not even exactly an attack on, contemporary society or anything of the kind, although his characters do get into some scrapes with their environments. But it really just presents this kind of worldview from a healthy point of view, from a man who clearly doesn't have any of the strange psychological quirks that so many of our brethren sadly seem to be suffering from, and who is able to put that into an absolutely delightful, in many cases hilarious, and in many cases very, very poignant language. So that's another example. To put it shortly, yes, we absolutely have fiction titles. We are looking to expand our fiction collection, and we will have a number of other fiction titles forthcoming in the coming months.
Well, first, when we're speaking, John, and when you have a moment, if you could just put the name of that German conference in our side chat here, and then we'll share it in the public chat so that people can check that out more. I'm curious about that as well. But to Jason's point, you've both written using this term Prometheus, as we were discussing a moment ago. John, yours a little more about a political order, and Jason's something more internal, but that can be also applied, as he said, to understanding the social order of the day. So I guess to both of you, if you want to share any more, because it sounds like you're both using this term as somewhat of as an avatar of our people. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a very basic way of saying it. So going back to what we were saying earlier about what has made us vulnerable to this kind of globalism, because we know there are subversive alien forces, but it does take two to tango, and we have to be able to look in the mirror and assess that as well. Things, and this is often said, of course, things that worked for us when we were living in a more homogenous state and were not encountering the rest of the world so regularly may now be used to our detriment. I think of something that we mentioned on this show a few weeks ago. You know, we hear a lot about Tacitus's Germania. One of the things that he wrote about them, the Germans, was that it was the worst crime to close your door on someone, to turn your back to someone. And that might have helped with your fellow tribesmen in harsh northern climes. But today, that's been transplanted into this suicidal welcoming of the stranger and letting in this Trojan horse that John was speaking about earlier, with the potential of terrorists in Europe and all the people flooding in, not being able to vet them. Yeah, so to both of you, that, as I mentioned earlier when we talked about technology and our natural inclinations, these twin drives in us, almost like the DNA, the spiral of DNA, how we often, Europeans really do seem, in our different ways, to be about, when we're at our best, we're harmonizing, we're synthesizing two drives that could, when they're out of balance, they could be very destructive, self-destructive and outwardly destructive, because Jason spoke to, he's included in his literature, certainly an acknowledgement of our Achilles heels, you could say, to keep on with the mythological theme. So yeah, I guess, John, if you could go first, you're our guest, but anything more you'd like to flesh out about what this term Prometheus means in its fullest, how it represents our peoples, both our strengths and our weaknesses?
It's a great question. I think that it's worth stating in the first place that Prometheus has been, to a certain extent, reclaimed in recent days. And this is reflected absolutely in what Jason was saying about his book, which I'm extremely intrigued by. This attempt to not only retell the myth, but to actually retell the myth in the fullest sense, to retell the myth in a new light, in a new way. And this indicates that there is a way in which we are confronting precisely that kind of trouble that you point us to, Jared, this kind of Achilles heel that we all have, to follow your expression. Now, Prometheus is taken by many people in our circles today to be representative of our will to explore the unknown, to seize upon the forbidden, to break through barriers, to break through borders, to break through anything that attempts to constrain us, and to attempt to gain that wider perspective or that greater power. So this is obviously a great theme of modernity. It's a great theme of modernity to attempt to expand one's realm of power, to attempt to gain knowledge of the universe, to attempt to utilize one's rationality toward the command of nature. All of these things are essentially modern, which puts us into a kind of troubling predicament, because it seems that this Promethean figure has emerged in a particular way for us in modernity. We seem in modernity to have achieved some kind of element of ourselves which was lacking prior to modernity. And this very element has led us to our present dilemma. The question then is how to confront that. Because on the one hand, we've discussed technology as an example of something that we cannot simply do without. We cannot go back and pretend like it never happened. We are confronted with the necessity of facing our present reality, which does not merely mean rejecting everything that exists now, which is an impossibility in the first place, and in the second place would essentially result in nihilism in the final accounting. We have to reclaim modernity in a certain way. And this is a very, very delicate operation, because prior attempts to reclaim modernity have done nothing but drive it deeper into the ground and make its effects worse. An example of this, just an evident example of this, is the nuclear bomb, which, could be a very great peacekeeping tool, but at the same time was also used to the destruction of a great many people during the war, and could potentially be used to the destruction of a great many more in a coming war. This reclamation of modernity, therefore, has to be done carefully, and it has to be done understanding what it is we're attempting to reclaim and what it is we're attempting to reject. And I think that that's where this use of mythology can really come in and play a part, because it allows us to play upon this as upon a theme, to use our powers of molding these kinds of plastic realities into something that provides a road ahead for us. And this is also the meaning of archaeofuturism on a certain level. Quite apart from Yamfai's specific recommendations or predictions or hopes, the idea of melding the past and the future implies this kind of redemption of modernity through our judicious use of it. And the problem here, of course, is that Prometheus violates the gods. I mean, he takes fire from the gods. He violates a taboo both of society and also of kind of the nature of things, the way things are. And in consequence of that, he is chained to a stone, and he is, his liver is eaten every day by an eagle for a very, very long time. So there are consequences to proceeding in this manner. There are consequences, potentially negative consequences, to our way of approaching the world. And if we do not recognize that and recognize the degree to which we ourselves have led ourselves into this present conundrum, we'll never get out of it. If we attempt to lay the blame on other parties, if we attempt to establish some kind of a scapegoat for what's happened to us, if we do not see the way in which we have led ourselves to this point, step by step, we will never see the way of breaking free of it. And I think that the figure of Prometheus can provide us with a way of getting out of this, insofar as we actually do take this as a living myth rather than as simply, let's say, a dead archetype which we want to impose on the modern way of being. And so it requires precisely the introduction of art, of fiction, of mythology. And if I can just return to the question that was asked regarding Arktos and its publishing of fiction, I think that this is a very, very important aspect of our work, and I think that it's probably an under-evaluated one. I think many of us who are in the position of being dissenters in our day tend to favor scientific approaches to the way things are. We tend to be very rational, so we tend to be able to analyze things very carefully and schematically, to break them down into their fundamentals, constituent parts, and to understand them on that level. A great many people are not capable of doing this. A great many people don't want to do this. And a great many people live in what is this very much a more natural way, insofar as they simply interact with the world around them on the level of morals, on the level of feelings and emotions, on the level of interpersonal relationships. Only art can lead us into that realm. We will never get there through analytic treatises. We will never get there through scientific studies. We will never get there through repeating again and again all of the extremely valid and sound arguments we have for critiquing the present state of affairs. We can only get there through breaking into that realm of mythology and breaking into the more artistic approach to things. And so, Jason, I salute you.
Well, no, thank you very much. I salute. It's brilliantly said. Those are the exact kind of things that we talk about in the community for white well-being, and the community that I am very proud of, a community that steps up not just as observers, people showing up for a little bit of entertainment, or people to see some of these folks who are tremendously educated, but are just pedantically prattling on and on. It seems like a lot of those folks, they like the attention that they get, but they're not working on doing something positive for our people. They're not using all of their genius, using all of their education to actually take steps, pragmatic steps forward. And that, in this community for white well-being, that's what we do. We focus on making changes, and we have this process, this lexicon and dialectics of going free that we have developed and are developing. People are using them. I'm going to be sharing some of these. I decided the other day, I tell you all that all of these messages I receive of folks who decide to finally use the lexicon and the dialectics, and they have these absolutely rewarding, heartwarming experiences and successes. And I just thought, I was reading one the other day, it was so glorious. I thought, I'm just going to read a couple of these every Going Free episode because people need to hear about the successes. There's nothing that succeeds like success. So we'll be talking more about that. And of course, John, one of the things we really heartily encourage in the service of white well-being is the production of art. And we just had I just played a song, The Coming War of Ideas, the other day on my channel. And the gentleman's stage name slips me at the moment, but it is magnificent. It is truly magnificent. And I'm going to be working more with him in the future. He has some ideas, specifically some very, I'm not going to let the cat out of the bag yet, but it is all related to the artistic work that I have done for the cause. And it's exciting. It's really exciting because the song is, if you listen to it, if you liked Iron Maiden back in the day, you almost won't be able to tell the difference in the quality. But when it comes to Prometheus Rising, I mean, the book it's lyric, it's written in a lyrical style, it's mythopoetic. As I said, there's theomacy, there's thaumaturgy, there are places are polyonymous, and groups of people are polyonymous as they would be in the, or are, not would be, in the real world. The Prometheus, the God, our creator, in whom we see all of our weaknesses, all of our strengths, etc. He suffers long before, at the hands of other gods. He suffers long before he ever creates us, and suffers in a way that is parallel to the way that we suffer. And he will recurrently goes through as we have, and he flees white flight as we have, until finally the day comes when he realizes that he'll be chased to the end of time, and will suffer ultimately because of it. And he finally realizes that what the true motivation is behind this animus, behind all of these clever arguments that are used against him, behind the manipulation of his desire to be objective, his desire to be fair, everything that we see in ourselves. He finally realizes what the true objective is, and then he mounts his rebellion. And that breaks out into the creation of us. And there are other peoples of mankind who are also created not by Prometheus, different gods for their origin. In fact, they are created in spite of us. And so there's a lot of meaning there as well, and conflict that is analogous to the conflict we see today. As I say, it is extremely allegorical, and it is a universe in and of itself in which I can write a great many more stories to serve our people's needs from ancient time all the way up, as I say, to the present. Any setting can be selected because it is a universe that encompasses all time. So I will now jump to some of these super chats before we proceed. We have, by way of the familiar alternative, Seeing Red, who donated $10 to the cause of white well-being. Thank you very much, my good friend over there. And he dug down into the description for that familiar alternative, and writing, Jason, I have read Go Free and purchased Born Guilty, awaiting Monday arrival. Thank you all for the work that you do for the advocacy of white well-being. Amen for that, and very well said. We have, by way of an unusual platform for super chatting, and nonetheless, it is available. Janice super chatting with $25 and saying, for an uplifting and fascinating stream. Thank you very much for that. That's over on Cash App. We also had Ryan super chatting over there at $3.51. Not writing anything, but the $3.51 for white well-being says all that needs to be said. So thank you both, and thank everyone who have and are super chatting during the course of the stream. We are going to be going over the anticipated 4:30 stop time, the tap out time, because we had some shenanigans, potentially intentional, at the beginning of the stream. So you were going to get the full 2 hours of John from Arktos and all of the great and profound questions that our brilliant Jared George, perhaps, as I said in the chat a little earlier, the next Jared Taylor of the white positive sphere, to share and ask of John. I pass it over to you, my good friend.
That's a bit much, but okay. Maybe over the decades we'll see, but that's quite a thing to say. But thank you. Yes, I'm glad that we spoke about art. John, I know we're just getting to know each other, but Jason and I both have creative projects, and as Jason was speaking to, encourage those from our audience as well. I feel very strongly about what you just said, that there's a place for the more scientific breakdowns, surveys, and statistics, and people knowing these things. They've been hidden from them. There's certainly a place for that. But what is going to motivate people? What is going to make you live and die for something? There has to be that energy and inspiration and human warmth and connection behind it. And it largely will be the arts that facilitates that kind of feeling in people. I will also say, to Jason's book, it's fascinating in that the structure of it is something, he hadn't studied this formerly, but I believe it's a Middle English cadence and meter that he maintains during it, even though he wasn't formally studied in that. And then the content itself, even though the story is original, there are many traits of European myths. The very beginning of Prometheus Rising, a lot of parallels with the Gununga Gap and the beginning of the cosmos in the Norse mythology, which, as Jason was sharing it with people, was delighted to find that there were these parallels. And some people didn't even believe him, but again, something that he did not study formally before writing it, which goes with something, again, both Jason and I feel very strongly about. And it's the kind of thing that's harder to talk about, it's harder to quantify, but that's what drives us to try to wrap some words around those things that are more ineffable. That's what drives the writers and the poets, right? And I sense that in you too, John, is that there is some kind of folk soul, that these stories are within us. And the very creation of Jason's book is a testament to that. I know he might not say them himself, might be a little too embarrassing to talk about yourself, but I would like to say it on his behalf, because it is such an honor to have Jason as a friend and colleague and be doing all this together. Now, let's get to a question that what we've been speaking about dovetails perfectly with, and that is staying on this theme of keeping who we are and yet uniting. How do you walk that fine line of uniting against the globalists? Because sometimes we see comments, and sometimes in certain moments, I admit I myself feel like I want to be isolationist, and there's this whole Fortress Europa thing. But we live in a hyper-connected world, a hyper-technological world, as we've already discussed. And there's very practical considerations, even with minerals in South Africa. And if we just get out of there, then the Chinese are going to take them over. And what if they surpass us in the building of certain technologies? So what are your thoughts? And again, this is a big subject, so it's something that we can comb over maybe a few times at a few passes, about how we assert our unique ethnos and the different ethnicities within the European world on the one hand, but also unite in perhaps a federation or a bloc for our common interests. And the question before that is, what do we do to get people to realize that we have those common interests to begin with?
Well, you certainly don't skimp on the difficult questions here. I like
No, we do not.
Right. So there are a number of questions here which we should probably attempt to disentangle. I think I'm actually going to start with the problem of the diversity of Western ethnoi first, the diversity of Western ethnicities, if you will, insofar as there are a variety of originating peoples that go into producing what you might call the whites, what you might call the people of European heritage, however you want to phrase that. There's a variety there. It's not a unity, and has never been a unity insofar as historically there have always been conflicts between the various groups, particularly on the European peninsula. This is the great European problem, that Europe is in a way united. One can speak in a sensible and clear manner of Europe as an entity and of the European people as a people. At the same time, there are historical conflicts, there are differences in language, there are differences in religion, there are differences in custom, which make a kind of total political and social unity, at the very least, extraordinarily difficult. And this is something that Europe has been facing now for centuries and centuries, if not millennia. That is only on the level of Europe. And the same thing could be said even on the level of European states. If you expand that now to include a kind of international scale, the problem becomes yet more complicated. And this is another one of the great problems that are facing us today. You seem to be touching all of the really difficult things that we're coming up against in our time. Now,
that's what this is about. That's what this show is about.
That's what it has to be about, right? I mean, that's what we're confronting. That's where we are today, and it's what we have to be talking about, because we've got to find a way of navigating these problems, or else we're not going to get anywhere. Now, one of the solutions which is proposed for this is essentially to attempt to found our unity on the racial level by saying that we're all whites, right? I mean, we all have this kind of underlying ethnic unity which can build a sense of brotherhood between us. This is a potential, but I think, honestly, I mean, to return to what we were saying before, I think without a very, very strong and very long-lasting grounding in mythology, in a kind of return to our deeper heritage, in the arts, and in a continual interaction with one another, I don't think that alone can suffice. That simple element of biology is not sufficient, in my opinion. Simply because it never has been sufficient historically. We see again and again that, again, there have been warring tribes in Europe since the beginning of Europe, notwithstanding the fact that, ethnically speaking, they were very, very similar from the start. Custom is of enormous importance in the life of the human being, and we cannot disregard that. Customs diverge from one another, and in many cases they conflict with one another, and this is true even in Europe. There are deep historical antagonisms within the European peninsula which cannot simply disappear because we are confronted with a great threat or a great enemy outside of Europe or outside of Europe's history. These things do not go away without a lot of work and a lot of time. And, you know, I mean, it's enough to point to the fact that there have been 2 world wars which have been sparked on the European continent within the past 100 years, and which led to an enormous amount of ravagement and death. Now,
but did the people want those, or was that a hostile elite that orchestrated that?
Well, without the hostile elite, it never would have happened. But one has to also recall exactly how enthusiastic the peoples of Europe were, and ready and gung-ho even to go to war with one another. I mean, unfortunately, this is just a historical reality. The peoples in that time were ready. They were ready for the war, and they thought that it would not be a long war. This is in both cases World War I and World War II. Now, this, again, would not have happened without that hostile elite that you're speaking of. It would not have happened, perhaps, if there had been an attempt to unify Europe on a different level. It might not have happened if Napoleon had succeeded in unifying Europe. There are any number of possibilities here. But it did happen, and we have to remember that. I think that, simply because I think that it's naive of us to believe that another war in Europe is not possible today. It's naive of us to believe that the European Union is going to stop that kind of a thing from coming about. And this could be a war even between the peoples of Europe. Unfortunately, this is a reality. And if we don't confront these very, very troubling possibilities, we will never find a way around them. Having said that, I think that we are in a position today which is absolutely, has never been known in the history of the Western peoples, put broadly. And that is to say that on account, in a certain respect, on account of liberalism and the way that it has eroded the customs of individual nations and produced this kind of mass man, there's also the possibility of overcoming some of the traditional and historical differences, which have unfortunately caused endless amounts of violence on Europe, on the European peninsula, that have caused violence even between Americans and Europeans, that have historically created a great many problems between us. That, I think, has to be where we turn our attention. We have to be looking toward the production of a new kind of ethics, a new kind of a way of being which is communal to us in some sense. This doesn't mean that we all have to eat the same food and wear the same clothing, which would be devastating to the traditional individual historical strands of Europe. It would be devastating to the nature of our peoples. But it does mean that there is the possibility now to find an overarching unity and an overarching sense of brotherhood that I do not think could have existed 50 years ago because the preconditions were lacking. It helps enormously that we are up against a very, very powerful enemy, and that this enemy is dedicated to destroying us by bringing in hordes and hordes of foreigners and essentially diluting the traditions and the customs and the ethnicity of our people through this kind of mass immigration. This provides a pivot point upon which we can begin to develop this kind of unity. It is very, very helpful as well that because we all see these problems, we can come to one another across the globe, meeting people of different nationalities who see these same problems, and in a certain sense we recognize one another, right? We understand that we're on the same level, we're fighting the same fight, we have the same problems, we have the same goals. This is an enormously promising beginning, but it's only a beginning, and it's something that we have to be continuously working toward, in my opinion. It's not something that we can ever take for granted in any sense of the word, because it's the sort of thing that we could lose very, very easily, and it's the sort of thing that will be aimed at as something to be undermined by the very hostile elite that you spoke of, Jared, by the very same people who are attempting to destroy us. It is dangerous to them to see this growing unity, and they will attempt to fragment it by any means at their disposal. And unfortunately, as we've seen, this is sometimes very possible for them to do. So there has to be a continual labor in this direction toward the production of an understanding, an implicit understanding between all of the Western peoples that at this moment in time, we have to come together, because if we don't, we're going to be eaten by the sharks.
Yes, we speak often here about nested layers of identity. We like these metaphors that other people have used for several years, like the Russian doll, or you drop a pebble in the water and there's the ripple effect. And that goes from individual to family, to larger family, community, region, ethnicity, nation, and then, of course, the larger cultural Western European sphere at large. So that is something that it's helpful to use, right? But I think that a lot of what made us vulnerable was a disconnection from roots, and some of it we've spoken about. Certainly, we talked about cities. Some of it there's a lot of different factors, but one that just pops into my head is we've discussed also the Industrial Revolution and how people poured out of the countryside into cities and lost a lot of their folk ways. So when you forget who you are, obviously, it's much easier to manipulate people. I would like to say, and people have heard me say this prior, but it's apropos, since you're on our show, a book published by Arktos, I believe, one of Ricardo Duchesne's, Faustian Man in a Multicultural Age, is an accessible book. I love his uniqueness of Western civilization as well, but it's a bigger, more academic book. And so for the general audience, somewhere to start, that book has some wonderful examples of things that unite us, and how symphonic music, once it was in one place in Europe, it was in all of Europe. Different European explorers, some of them being of Northern European stock, some of them being the English and Scandinavian explorers who climbed the highest peaks or walked across Antarctica just to do it. No one else does that. But he'll also invoke the Portuguese and the Spanish explorers. So he does a nice job of painting these brushstrokes and showing these different traits that perhaps in other people's are exceptions, but in ours it's a more tried and true trait of exploration. He quotes Spengler at length, talking about symphonic music, let's say, or the vanishing point in art of how we're looking for that infinite. Spengler always talking about drive for the infinite, always looking outward. What more can we do? How much further can we go? I tell you, everyone in the audience, that you read that book and your heart will swell with pride and love of where we come from. Not to make light of what we're speaking about here. There are, and I'm speaking as an American, and I try to be very cognizant of that, there are old conflicts, as John was saying, on the European peninsula, and I can't just sit here in America and wish them away. But hopefully the kind of work that I mentioned, the kind of work Duchesne is doing and so many others, will show us those common points of origin, and people like us will ingest that, and then, as we're discussing, create new art, create new myths that will show some unity among these as well. Certainly our folk and fairy tales as well. There's a lot of overlap from the different areas, the different general ethnicities of Europe: Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, even Greco-Roman. Duchesne, I should say, also points out that it's only really in Norse myth and Greco-Roman myth that men are on par with the gods, are peers with the gods, commune with the gods, still make choices in the face of the gods, rather than being kind of bowing in deference and a more unilateral, despotic kind of top-down system that's reflected in those cultures as well. So a lot there, but Jason, I'm curious if you have anything to say on what we've been discussing.
Actually, am I coming through okay?
Yes.
Okay. Actually, I've been catching up on the tech side behind things. So we do have a question though from Yonash, and he is asking John if he's ever read of the Clash of Civilizations, and if so, what he thought of it. So that's a question that's also, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, was asked over on Entropy as well. If you are not over there, we do have a poll going, and it looks like most people, in fact, I think it's 100%. I'll have to go back and check, but most people are saying that they would like to have John come back and talk with us in depth about Prometheus Rising.
Well, that is very kind of all of you, and I'll take the opportunity to thank all of our viewers and all of the Super Chat donators and all of those who contributed a question and all of those who are listening. So thanks very much. Now, as to the question, yes, I have read that book. It has been many years now, and actually I would like to reread it now that I have a better grasp of certain things that I think when I read the book, I probably did not understand with adequate clarity. In general, I think that the theory that the book proposes is relatively sound. I think that there are certainly civilizational blocks in the world, and these civilizational blocks do come into conflict with one another. In a way, I think that it's more satisfying to understand history in terms of civilizational blocks than in terms of nations, because nations are kind of messy. They have unclear borders that can shift on the basis of political exigencies. Civilizations, although they're less scientifically definable, they seem to me to have a certain clarity because one can point to them and grasp them in a kind of intuitive way. It's very difficult to grasp particularly newborn nations. For example, Italy, when it was first emerging, was just this kind of hodgepodge of all sorts of different peoples put together, and this has been true of many nations. Civilizations have a kind of internal integrity, and it makes some sense to speak of Western civilization. This has become more difficult to do, particularly with the decline of the West, on account of the fact that we have made such a mess of our individual nations, and on account of the fact that there have been these enormous wars within Western civilization, which the idea of a civilization is somewhat hard-pressed to explain, insofar as one should expect to see integrity and unity there, and in fact one sees bloodshed. So to that extent, I think that it's very useful to think of the world in terms of these conflicting civilizations. I think that the conflict, particularly between the Islamic world and the Western world, practically since the beginning of the Islamic expansion, well over 1,000 years ago, is certainly a very, very useful way of understanding what has happened between these two parts of the globe. This has been modified in recent times by the fact that we are in the process of losing our civilization, and the same thing can be said for many Muslim parts of the world. There is this force that we've been discussing, globalism and liberalism and neoliberalism, these kinds of erosive, corrosive forces which come in and destroy the native ways of being of individuals and attempt to reduce them to this kind of lowest common human denominator, to the point that they're not even recognizable any longer. When this occurs, civilization and the conflicts between civilizations become less acute. And other questions tend to take the place of them, such as economic interests, economic conflicts. In many cases, also differences in appearance, ethnic differences, can take the place of civilizational questions. So to an extent, for example, I think that the phenomenon today of sort of secularized Muslims is a very real one. There are a great many Muslims in the United States and in Europe who are certainly not jihadists, and they're not terrorists, and they don't particularly believe in their religion, even though they claim to, exactly as many Christians. They are not the same kind of human being as was produced by Muslim civilization, by Islamic civilization. And they're not the same kind of human being that was produced by Western civilization on the side of the Christians. I mean, these are fundamentally different than they used to be. And the consequences of that are seen also in the level of conflicts, the level of the way that they interact with one another. So at that point, I think the theory of clashing civilizations to some extent needs to be modified, or it begins in certain cases even to fall apart. But nonetheless, I think that it's a useful way of looking at the kind of the wider picture of the globe.
It's very well said. Well, I think what we're running out of time, regrettably. This has been a fantastic discussion. We're absolutely going to have you back to discuss this more, because I would like to go in a little bit more deeply when we have you back as well on this, the impetus behind the infliction of harm on our people and on Western kind, because there clearly is, as you're talking about there, an economic motive to break down these borders. And this is something that it's a very sophisticated topic, and we're going to have to find a way to create a context or contexts that, as I've mentioned before, as the human animal is a cyclical animal, we're going to have to find a way to create contexts that are also cyclical, that incentivize activities that enrich individuals to whatever degree that these economies of our future and government structures of our future, which again I believe are going to have to be cyclical in nature because the creature creating them is cyclical. So this idea that something could be written down for all time is, and it'll just fix things for all time, is short-sighted, is myopic. So there are going to need to be these and also these balancing powers, not just different branches of government, but there needs to be balancing powers in economies as well. So it's going to be an extremely complex thing. We're going to be able to do it because we are Western kind, and there's nothing that has ever stymied our genius throughout all of history. We will find a way. Part of finding that way is recapturing our destiny. But as I say, we're going to have to create contexts in which people can enrich themselves, because they're always going to be pursuing their self-interest, in a way that always enriches our people as a whole. We cannot continue to have contexts in which the best course of action in order to compete on a global market is to disenfranchise, disempower, harm the people of our countries by our wealthy, to harm the people of our countries so that products can be made cheaper someplace else, sold back in, or so that other peoples can be brought into the country to lower and depress the wages. So that, because at all times, all human animals are in conflict, not only with their environment, but each other. And I say human animal only in the sense that we live in the bodies of mammals, and we have very similar drivers vis-a-vis the competitive edge. So these wealthy, even though we look at them with these saucer-sized eyes at the wealth, for them, they are competing with the others at their level of wealth. And there is a continual jockeying. There is no stasis. There is no calcification. There is no, this is the leadership. No, there is fear. There is hatred. There is competition. There is shouldering out of the way. And if you want a different outcome, if you want different behavior than that, you need a new species. We need to accept who and what we are, and then to create contexts in which the pursuit of these objectives that are natural for each of us as individuals serve the totality of the community. Not an impossible task. Having said that, the real objective, I firmly believe, the real motivator is the jealousy and envy that resides in the heart of every anti-white, which is why they seek to inflict harm, which is why they are fanatic, which is why they seem unhinged, because they have named themselves victims. But victims of what? Victims of chance, victims of God, victims of fate. The only thing for them to get their retaliation, the only way to feed this is by naming themselves victim. They gain the right of self-defense. They then take the average white person as the avatar for all of Western kind's glory and accomplishments, all of the different things that they may be jealous of. And in large measure, I think perhaps even in largest measure, it is our great and glorious history that people, whether they're white anti-whites or non-white anti-whites, they do not feel the connection to that dignity that the glorious history conveys to our people, the dignity that I tell all of you right now, the feelings of joy and glory when you finally decide. I took great pride in being a Southerner, and I took great pride in being an American. And then when I realized that I could take pride in all of my people's creations of all time, of all around the world, the pride and the feeling of potential achievement went through the roof. The exact opposite of what some of these other gurus out there will say today, that you can't take pride in the accomplishments of your people. Folks, that is a recipe to lead you straight to hell. You absolutely can take pride in the work of your people, and it is on their shoulders that you will do greater deeds. So that is something that I think I'd like to explore next time we talk, because without question, there is an economic driver as a consequence of contexts that have been established. And this is something that is largely beyond the control at the highest level, where it is law of the jungle, but certainly on the economic level of an individual country. Context, this is the 200 IQ plus level of control. Contexts have been created so that the brightest members of any said community pursue their self-interests in a way that enriches those who are already enthroned in power. So they, by working for their own advancement and achievement, they further enrich and empower the individuals at the top of that pyramid. That is what we need to understand how to undermine. And that's what we're doing here. That's why it's so important to talk about the dialectics, the lexicon that we use when we are in discussions with anti-whites, because that is the way that we break free of the control of our thinking, of the control of our language. And until you do that, you can't break free your behavior. The control of our behavior is by way of the control of our thought. And the control of our thought is by an interpretation, a perception of reality, by the words and ideas that we are allowed to argue and debate with. That is why going free has been so powerful for so many people. Now, we are here at the end. I'm going to read our final super chats that we have here, and we'll get maybe a quick answer from John when he wraps up and gives his final points as well. I would like to say this has been an absolutely just sterling time. I have had a fantastic, despite what the anti-whites tried to do at the beginning of the show, all that did was give us a good time. It gave us a different beginning to a tap episode than we've had in the past. So it was, thank you actually to the anti-whites for mixing things up a bit. But let's see, we have the other Josh Randall super chatting with $10. Did I mention that I love this channel and the chat community that gathers here? It's been a great journey slogging off the cultural programming friends. Well, thank you so much for those kind words, Josh. And folks, I absolutely encourage you all to share your testimony when you use the ideas shared here, when you use the vernacular shared here, and you find yourself getting stronger, you find that you have more access to your potential physical, mental, and spiritual as a consequence of treating these mean pathogens with which the anti-whites have infected you. Share that. When you share this curative contagion with your friends, family, and strangers, and you see difference in them, you see them now suddenly lending an ear to the arguments you're making, share that. Folks need to hear this. I said it on, I think it was on the last Going Free that I did last Sunday. that a great demonstration of our sickness, of the infections that the anti-whites have inserted into our minds from the earliest ages that they could, is the fact that we merely find it, many of us merely find it terrifying to speak out against the infliction of harm against our people. To even say that something is anti-white scares the hell out of a lot of you. And that is something that should do two things. It should be a challenge to you to get by it. And it should also, the second thing is, it should be a tome of information on how deeply you have been wounded, how deeply you are suffering from white noir, that you are afraid to even object to the infliction of harm on our people. You're not saying, when you say something's anti-white, you're not saying that you're white positive. You're not saying, let's do X, Y, or Z for white people. You're merely saying, that is harming white people. Why are you doing that? And you're afraid of that. So that is something that we should absolutely get past, and we should share the stories that we make when we bring others to the process of going free, especially when we are finally able to say, you know what, that commercial was anti-white. That couple there, the things they're doing, that's anti-white. That over there, what I see in this movie is white erasure. Get the courage to say those things, and you'll see the rewards, not only in the folks around you, but also in yourself. So thank you very much, Josh, for that super chat. We have your drunk uncle super chatting $28. My dearest nephew, Richard, is a bit nerdy, and I'm an old Nixonian law and order. People of any race who break law of community brotherhood or the original Constitution should be tickled by professional ticklers, especially during tickling duels. So thank you very much for that, you drunk uncle. Remember now, we are functioning on our victimizers platform. We have to be careful about the things we say, but we do appreciate that kind investment in the cause of white well-being. We will make it go a great distance. We have the Zero Schizo back again with 2 more Peruvian soul. He's used up their treasury at this point. Asking John thoughts on Diego, I'm guessing this is Italian, Fuserio from Italy. Oh, from Italy. So it is from Italy. And we'll get that answer from John if he knows this individual when he gives his final thoughts. I want to really quickly thank some folks and spotlight people I saw in the audience. I saw Shauna Machiavellia Sucks was here today. Ivory Rose. Mary Moon was here. Great to see you. Windhammer. That's a great name. Great to see you. Lisa, Tim, Zendrofen was here, and Powder Beast. Thank you all for being here. Thank everyone. A big thank you to everyone for super chatting, of course. Deepest gratitude for that. Thank you for everybody who commented and asked questions, who participated on Entropy, who dove down into the description for the familiar alternative that was Seeing Red. I don't think anybody else dug down there today, that intrepid journey. What I would like to do, though, is ask John for his final thoughts, what he's working on, where people can find him, where people can support him. And please do support John and the work he's doing. Follow the work that he is doing. Buy his new book about the new Prometheans. I'm sure to be scintillating. And John, also, if you have any thoughts on Diego Fusero from Italy, please, sir, the floor is yours.
Excellent. All right. Well, to begin with the last thing first, Diego Fusaro. In fact, I was translating his work just this day. Diego Fusaro is a very, very interesting figure. He is an Italian intellectual who came to age in his intellect in a thoroughgoing Marxist philosophy. He is, in fact, an avowed Marxist. What's intriguing about this is that, let's say 50 years ago, a Marxist would surely have stood at the opposite side, again, of that famous political spectrum with respect to any of us, probably. I'm certainly not keen on communism myself, but nonetheless, the critique that Fusaro makes of contemporary society has an incredible number of extremely valid points to it, and points which parallel our own. This is indicative to me not only of the fact that, as I stated before, this traditional spectrum is falling to pieces around us, but that it opens up new possibilities. It opens up new possibilities to make strategic alliances with persons who it would not have been possible to make alliances with just 50 years ago, because the ideology was too strong and it was leading in two different directions. In terms of a critical view of the contemporary society, there are valid points that come from the left as much as from the right, the conventional traditional left and right. And there is a way in which these so-called extremes, which is to say persons who are very, very deeply delving into the underlying structures of our society in an attempt to understand what has gone wrong and how we can get out of it, seem to be tending in a similar direction. This is not to say, obviously, that I embrace communism, and this is not to say that a communist and a person of the new right are going to come to any kind of agreement about a political order which might be discovered. But it is to say that we might have something to learn from one another, and that we might have enough common ground that we can join with one another in terms of critiquing the society, in terms of understanding its failings, and in terms of perhaps plotting a course ahead. So I think that it behooves all of us to attempt to overcome the historical antagonisms between ideologies which by now are bankrupt and dead, and to attempt to understand exactly where our common ground really does lie and how much of it there is. With that, I want to do nothing more than to thank you both, gentlemen, for a very, very engaging conversation. It has been a delight to join you this evening. Thank you for the questions that you've asked. Thanks again to our audience for listening in and for contributing some excellent questions. If I neglected any of your questions, it is simply because I did not know the answer, or the material was quite beyond my range of knowledge or expertise. So thank you all very much for your contributions, and it's been my honor.
Thank you very much, brother. Jared, please.
The pleasure is ours, John. It's been excellent. We have a regular contributor, Seaver Hamlin, saying I caught that he said earlier in the chat, go for 6 hours. I don't know if we're going to do 6 hours all at once. We're technically in the first overdrive right now, since we didn't really get up and going until 2:45 our time here in the Eastern United States. So we surpassed that at 4:45 and not about 5. So we're in that first 15-minute overtime. Sport Warrior Queen, one of our moderators, and she's very involved with Poseidon over there in Greece, also said one of the greatest guests, have to have you back. So it has been an incredible conversation. We didn't even get to, I'll just give people a little teaser. I wanted to ask John about his view of the United States from Europe, because he's based in Italy, of course. He's based in Italy. Also some news from Italy, Salvini, the migrant invasion, all good things like that. Elitism and populism, the dangers and consequences of not being shown our recent history, and something we were probably about to get to in the latter portion of the show, had we had more time. The next logical question was about an ethno-cultural and even genetic bottleneck going on in the wider European world, sorting out who really wants to be here and who doesn't. So many questions we didn't even get to, but John, do know that I note the things that we didn't get to with a particular guest, so we can maybe pick up on a future conversation, and I'm sure there will be more topics that come up, but it's really been wonderful to speak with you. I will tell our audience that even though we didn't get to speak with John about Italian politics, I'll give you a little hint. We will have someone on next week who also has ties to Italy. Will be able to tell us a little about Italian politics, a little more about Italian ethno-spirituality, but she does appreciate the beauty of the Nordics as well. Let me know next week if you got the hint of who our scheduled guest is for next week. It's going to be a fantastic show, another breakthrough in this amazing summer guest lineup that we've been able to compile here on the After Party. It's just been a pleasure week to week to speak to these amazing people. I will note, please mark in your calendars, the After Party will not be on Thursday next week. That's been our usual day these last few months. But right now, unless things change, so always please do check me and Jason on our social media. It will be on Saturday. Saturday, I believe, is the 27th. Jason, correct me if I'm wrong. And we'll be starting at 4 p.m. Eastern time. That's 9 o'clock in the UK and 10 o'clock at night in CET. Yes, that is Saturday, the 27th. I also do want to mention just one more thing. It's been a summer with amazing guests on the After Party. It's also been a summer of some surprises, some new projects. One of those was skits. I did the first skit with Philosophicat and there's more on the way. But I have another summer surprise for you all. If you didn't see the Twitter announcements, just yesterday I started announcing this with Australia's lovely Porridge, a gentleman that's been on the show a couple of times. We have started this initiative where we have this nationalist content creators contest, and it's called Last Message to the West. And we're giving you 3 months to make a video. And the great thing about this is we already have some big names who have agreed to do it. But of course, even if you're a small content creator, or even if you're in the audience and you've never made a video before, there are already people talking about making little production teams. Someone will write a script, someone will read the script, someone will do the graphics, someone will do the music. We're looking for videos, very short, very concise, 5 minutes in length, imagining that this will be played in stadiums around the world, on TV monitors around the world. If you had a last message before getting censored as to why and how to galvanize our people more, what is at stake to wake people up, to be as creative as you can be about that, but also having a broad appeal. I have to say, Lovely Porridge and I do reserve the right to not show everything. Obviously, we might get some trolls, but we might get some people who are maybe well-intentioned, but are going to get our channels banned. So we do have to be smart, but that also makes us have to be more clever with the common general audience. The idea is to have these videos be an outreach to the people out there who might be dipping a toe in our ideas, but are hesitant for any number of reasons and don't quite know what to think yet. So we do have a little cash prize. Right now it's $200 for the first prize, but some people have actually messaged us and agreed to kick in some more generously. So if we check that out and everything's good, the first prize, the stakes may be rising, but you have until October 15th. We have a new channel called Kindred Creators that is just dedicated to the videos that are going to be the entries for this project. So you can put it on your channel with a hashtag. There's all kinds of directions in the announcement video that's on my YouTube page, and I shared in the chat, and I know our moderators will be sharing in the chat again. But you'll be hearing about this continually. But of course, it's good to have a jump on this. You have a good 3 months since it is that October 15th deadline. But no matter who wins, this is the beautiful thing. And this is when Porridge was last on our show, he spoke to us a little about this off air. The initial seed of it is his idea. I always like to give credit where credit is due. But the beautiful thing is, of course, the competition, little healthy competition is good, right? It makes us bring out the best in ourselves. But think about this. We'll have a library of videos. And maybe then people in the future can recombine or re-edit videos. But we'll have a library of material that are really going to challenge some of the best in our sphere to, again, come up with a video that galvanizes us, but is also an outreach to those out there in the masses who don't quite think like us quite yet. So we're challenging ourselves, we're challenging each other to be as creative as we can be, to use our power of language, of communication, to make this last message to the West. What would you make if you knew it would be played around the world, but then you'd be censored? It would be your last message. What would you say? That is the ante that Lovely Porridge has given us, and I've helped him organize this. So more details on my Twitter, more details on my site. I'm going to do a site post, and you might have caught the link to this announcement video in the chat. But other than that, please do find everything I do at thegreatorder.com. Again, John, it was a pleasure speaking with you, and I hope this is not the last time. With that, I'll give it to you, Jason, to bring us out.
Thank you, good sir. And I'm just going to really quickly thank our redoubtable moderators today. We had Syrup, we had Phoenix was in there, Spartan, Warrior Queen, who just said, make white babies. The process is the best part. So thank you all. And now we're going to be checking out, and I'm going to be blasting Luke Mason's The Coming War of Ideas, which you can find on my channel. Jared, I did drop the video for you and Porridge's challenge in the chat just a moment ago. So you folks, you can find that there. Watch that first, and then hop over to my channel and make sure you also follow HB 2014 in case he did any. I see you say, what about me? In case he did, if you did any moderating today, good sir, I thank you for that. Normally, though, I thank you very much for all you do in being our clip specialist. So thank you very much for that. Watch Jared's video, Jared and Porridge's video. Hop on over to my channel, jam out to Luke Mason's The Coming War of Ideas, and we look forward to seeing you all again next time.